The next panel is going to focus on the dual-use nature of space assets and their potential impacts on outer space security. And to moderate that panel, it will be led by Almudena, who has been the Master of Ceremony throughout the day. And in terms of speakers, we have David Koplow, then we also have Dmitry Stefanovich and Laura Grego, who I believe Almudena will introduce in more depth. With that, though, I shall hand over the floor to you, Almudena. Please, over to you.
So I am very excited to be presenting this last panel for the day on dual-use space objects and their potential impact on outer space security. For this panel, we are going to have 3 panelists joining us virtually, as Jamie said. The first of the panelists that we have today is David Koplow. He is a professor at Georgetown University Law Center, and he teaches and writes in the areas of national security law, international law, and he was actually a professor of mine when I was studying at Georgetown, so I'm very pleased to be welcoming him today. He has previously served in the US government at the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, the Department of Defense, and NASA. The second speaker that we have joining us today is Dmitry Stefanovich. He is a research fellow at the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations for the Russian Academy of Sciences. He graduated with honors from the Institute of International Relations at the Moscow Engineering Physics Institute, and he is the author of numerous publications for journals and media. He has participated in several projects and publications, including CIPRI and UNIDER, and his research interests are strategic weapons, long-range precision weapons, disruptive technologies, and their impact on international security and strategic stability, as well as arms control and regional security. Last but not least, we have joining us today Dr. Laura Grego. She is a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at MIT's Laboratory for Nuclear Security and Policy. She's currently on leave from the Union of Concerned Scientists Global Security Program, where she is a senior scientist and research director. She is a physicist by training, and she works in the intersection of science and policy on the topics of nuclear weapons, missile defense, and space security. And she has authored several papers on topics ranging from cosmology to nuclear security issues, and has testified before the US Congress and the United Nations. She earned her PhD in experimental physics from the California Institute of Technology. So I am very excited to be welcoming all of these excellent panelists today to talk about dual-use capabilities. As we have done in the previous sessions, we are going to open the floor to each of the panelists for them to provide some introductory remarks on the role of, or the nature of dual-use space objects and the impact that they can have on space security. So without further ado, perhaps I could give the floor to Laura Grego.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and of course, thank you all. Thank you to Unidir and Almudena, and thank you all for assembling to talk and think about this very important topic. Of course, I appreciate being asked to speak in this context because you are charged with creating good agreements to reduce the dangers associated with military uses of space. And I'm very interested in this, the focus of this panel, because I do believe that dual-use technologies is where a good amount of our attention should be paid. But I think when I was thinking about what to say in my brief remarks, I thought it might be useful to describe what I think dual-use technology isn't, which might help circumscribe the problem as I see it. The vast majority of the nearly 4,100 satellites currently in space are absolutely unsuited to being weapons of any kind. They are rather fragile, expensive systems with limited ability to maneuver, generally just enough to keep on station. While they can move, they don't have the capability of approaching another satellite closely, and certainly not stealthily, they could not be deorbited to land on a specific ground target. So the idea that any satellite could be used as a weapon should very much be put to rest. Satellites, on the other hand, that are designed to be weapons, either targeting other satellites or targeting the ground, will be designed quite differently and very specifically to that purpose. For example, a space-based laser would need a large mirror and a large power source. It would be fairly easily identified by external observations, what it looked like or its behavior. It would need to be tested. It's not the kind of system you could count on to work the first time. Similarly, a satellite that's meant to deliver mass to large distances in the form of an interceptor, for example, will not look anything like a communications satellite. It would be very difficult to disguise, in my opinion. Other weapons might be identified by their behavior, for example, space mines, which might be small satellites that trail their target and which would be set to detonate at a particular time, could be identified by behavior. Therefore, when you're talking about arms control in space, for example, the idea that you cannot define what you need to talk about, I think, is very much overstated. I think you can go quite a long way looking at the technology. Most satellites, again, are not usable as weapons, and most dedicated weapons will look very specific in construction or behavior. So the exception here are the technologies that are dual use or could be disguised as something else. The most prominent examples, of course, are highly maneuverable satellites that can closely approach other satellites, sometimes called proximity operation satellites. This technology, of course, is useful for many benign purposes and beneficial purposes, such as the refueling and repair sometime in the future. Assembling large structures in space, active debris removal. They can also be capable of being less benign, but entirely passive activities, such as intelligence gathering and signals interception. The most aggressive use of this technology would become close to and interfere with the satellite and damage or destroy it. So in this case, the enabling technology is the ability to rendezvous with a satellite without that satellite's cooperation, even if it's perhaps actively avoiding a rendezvous. But the problem is the behavior using that technology, but not the technology itself. So then it's a problem of situational awareness, the ability to track satellites' positions and where they are maneuvering to. Again, it seems that, so if it's a situational awareness issue, that's something that is fairly well solvable. Although currently situational awareness in space is not uniformly distributed. Some countries can do it much better than others. But in that sense, I think once that problem is solved, you can, in a sense, approach this problem in a way that you know that actions can be attributed if there's an agreed set of principles, such as an appropriate standoff distance, that could mitigate a lot of the danger. The risk I see is the risk of misperception and mistake. While there's a modest amount of this ability to see what's happening in space, you really do need to be able to have situational awareness more widely, and you also need to have robust communication channels to say, this is a behavior I see that's problematic. Could you explain it, or could you back off? So while we might have physical awareness of what's happening in space, we don't always understand each other's intentions and motivations, and that is certainly an issue to be solved. I have other areas of dual-use technologies that I think will deserve attention that will primarily be proposed defensive systems, either on orbiting satellite bodyguards and long-range ballistic missile defenses, both of which will have some capability as offensive systems. So that's a different kind of technology. They're weapons, but they're described and developed as defensive weapons. I know that dual-use technologies have been regulated in many areas before, and we have some experience with how to do this. I'm not an expert in that, but certainly there are frameworks. The Chemical Weapons Convention has separated substances into 3 groups in not such a dissimilar way as I'm describing. Some substances have little or no legitimate use besides chemical warfare. Some have small scale use that's legitimate, but most of it is not. And others have very important non-weapons use, and they're regulated in different ways. So those are some basic remarks, sort of a basic framework about the way I'm thinking about it. I would be happy to have a robust discussion about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your remarks. Perhaps if we could move on to Dmitry.
I'm very happy to be here. And first things first, I have to admit that a lot of topics have already been covered during the previous sessions, and like I was very much impressed with the quality of the discussions that have been here so far. Still, I'd like to contribute to the debate with more thoughts, and will do my best to focus on the challenge of the dual-use nature of space assets. However, I will address also not only the space assets per se, like things that are deployed to space, but also things that are related to space. Well, first things first, dual use is inherent. It is the quality that was in place since the dawn of the space era. Basically, with development of space launch vehicles was closely connected with the development of ballistic missiles. Today, for example, space assets that are developed in order to have a capability to monitor some types of natural catastrophes, and this definitely needs capability to, well, stay on target as long as possible. Same capabilities can be used to monitor the theaters of war and provide targeting, provide ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Satellites that can be used for civilian communications can also be repurposed for battle management communications. And even within the military domain, there are different levels of dual capabilities. And I think it is also something that we should remember. For example, some satellites designed for early warning can be also used for communications. Two weapons designed for missile defense, for ABM, can be used for anti-satellite missions. As mentioned, intelligence gathering satellites can also probably be repurposed for targeting. Inspector satellites can be turned into space torpedoes, as our American colleagues sometimes say. And even some radar imaging satellites and communication satellites can be repurposed for electronic warfare. Another example of such dual capability is the development of light, easy reusable launchers that can, of course, be used for purely civilian purposes. But if we speak about military domain, their original intended mission would be the swift replenishment, restoration of constellations of satellites of different types, but they also can be used to swiftly deploy ASAT capabilities, I mean co-orbital ASAT capabilities. If we speak about deployment of assets to space, to orbits, there is a notion of so-called precision deployment of assets to space, like existing or future space planes, rocket planes, and space tugs, and of course none of those should be crewed. I'm confident that it is impossible to agree to limit capabilities of space launch vehicles, limit the power of radars or communications satellites, or to cancel all rendezvous and proximity operations, because all of those have purely civilian purposes, and it's hard to make a point that we should deprive this or that nation, this or that actor of such capabilities. However, these limits can be enforced, or at least agreed on, not by the capabilities, but with regard to their behavior. Of course, even without actual destructive acts, both kinetic and non-kinetic, a lot of types of interference can have enormous impact, but such interference can be limited as well. We can and we should agree on which real actions should be a no-go. We basically need to address not the hardware and also not the software, but the principles on how these capabilities are actually used. Probably one of the ways to look at this challenge is to try to discuss the red lines. There are obvious disadvantages to such approach, because definitely if we have a red line, then some actors may get the perception that anything below this red line is the thing they can do, can actually achieve something by remaining under the red line. So there might be some different agreed lists of actions that are considered for this or that type of retaliation. Of course, like some things like actual destruction of a space asset will be considered a precondition for actual military response. Other types of actions like temporary jamming or dazzling or so-called dangerous maneuvers which do not lead to actual collisions, these have to lead to some type of formal consultations to agree on what had happened. And also some joint efforts in space situation awareness can and should contribute to the success of such formal consultations. And of course, there should be like a final list of actions in space that can actually lead to nuclear use. Obviously, these will have something to do with damaging early warning or nuclear command control communications capabilities. Finally, the gravest of concerns is the deployment of actual strike capabilities in space, both in terms of space-to-space or space-to-surface missions. A discussion on what actually constitutes a space-based weapon, such discussion can be continued indefinitely. And I believe in this case, one way to look at this issue is again like behavior-based. Lastly, not everything can be simulated. And if this or that system in outer space might be considered basically a weapon, unless it is tested as such, it is not such a big issue. Because, well, I might be too optimistic, but I have serious doubts that any military official will be ready to use any capability that will obviously have huge consequences, both for its success or its failure. So he will be reluctant to use this capability unless it was properly tested. My final point would be that, as with some other areas, we definitely can have a politically or even a legally binding regime without agreeing on strict definitions. The only thing that we need is the political will of relevant actors to engage in the proper discussions. And with that, I'll stop, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dmitry. A lot of interesting points there. But before I ask you questions about the issues that you both you and Laura raised, if I could please invite David to take the floor.
Let me begin by congratulating the organizers for assembling a terrific series of presentations on this very timely and complicated and important set of issues. Almu and Unidir and the sponsors, thank you for including me in this very challenging set of topics. And there is nothing more complicated and more urgent to address than dual use or dual capable systems. And for my purposes today, I want to dive into one specialized legal aspect of the question that, in my view, has not received the degree of attention that it really deserves, and that's the effect of dual use, dual capable systems during a time of armed conflict. And for this purpose, I want to use a broad definition of dual use to include satellites that are used simultaneously or interchangeably, sequentially, for military and civilian purposes, including remote sensing and communications, and not just the possibility that an ostensibly civilian satellite could be used to maneuvered in an anti-satellite weapons mode. Frankly, I consider that scenario pretty remote for the reasons that Laura has amply demonstrated. But the possibility of the reality that satellites can serve both civilian and military customers on a continuing basis is an important one for international law. And the focus for my remarks is the observation that during a time of armed conflict, the law does not recognize a category called dual use. During armed conflict, everything is either a military objective or a civilian object. And there's no intermediate or mixed category. If a satellite serves a military function, if it becomes a military objective, then it is subject to targeting. If it remains entirely civilian in its nature, location, purpose, and use, then it cannot be targeted, cannot be lawfully targeted by the opposing military during a time of armed conflict. So you've got either military objectives or civilian objects, and a dual-use satellite, something that serves intermittently or sequentially both military and civilian customers for communications or remote sensing or any of the other functions of satellites, it becomes a military objective subject to attack. Now, some satellite owners and operators are willing to tolerate that degree of risk. Either they figure that the chances of war in space breaking out are low, or the chances of their satellite being targeted are low. But others might prefer not to be so closely married to military operations that they become vulnerable to an attack during a time of armed conflict. And my particular focus on dual-use satellites takes the analysis one step earlier, so that it's not just in armed conflict, but in anticipation of armed conflict. One of the fundamental rules of armed conflict is discrimination or distinction, that a military force can target its attacks only against military objectives and not against civilian personnel or objects or others who are protected under the law of armed conflict. And a corollary to that rule of distinction or discrimination is a requirement that a military must separate itself to the extent feasible from civilians for the purpose of trying to mitigate the harm that armed conflict will inevitably impose upon civilians and civilian objects, and to permit the adversary to carry out its duty to fight honorably, to fight lawfully, by directing their attacks only against our military and military objects. If the military and the civilian forces are too intertwined, if they cannot be separated, then the opposing military cannot effectively target only military objects. And therefore, the law requires, to the extent feasible, that a military remove itself from civilians or remove civilians from the military, from the scene of the military activity. And that's a small but well-known, well-worked-out principle of military operations that requires the military to separate itself, to the extent feasible, from civilian objects. And in terrestrial or Navy air battles, that's traditionally done. The military is obligated to avoid intertwining itself with civilians and civilian objects. In space, however, it has been the consistent policy of the United States and others to avoid that obligation. The official policy of the United States is to rely upon civilian space assets for the performance of military and intelligence community functions, deliberately intertwining military functions into civilian spacecraft. And that violation of the law of armed conflict, some refer to this as a principle of passive precautions. I think of it really as a function, a reverse side of the principle of distinction. The violation of that principle of distinction makes it practically impossible for the adversary to target only the military assets, and I think runs contrary to the general function of the law of armed conflict, which is to try to limit armed conflicts, to try to spare civilians the worst effects of armed conflict in any domain. And therefore, my argument is that it's a mistake and an illegal act for the United States and others to insinuate military activities into civilian spacecraft, to try to intertwine military and intelligence community functions with civilian spacecraft, and that it's both unwise and illegal to violate the principles of discrimination or distinction in that way. So that's one special aspect of the problem of dual-use satellites, that such category does not exist during a time of armed conflict. And in anticipation of armed conflict, there ought to be much more attention paid to segregating civilian and military assets the way we do on land, sea, and air is the rule that we ought to follow in space as well. I'll leave it for there and look forward to further discussion.
Thank you so much, David, for that very special and not very well-known perspective of dual-use space objects. One thing that I noticed that all of the speakers mentioned is some form of definition of what dual use is. Even if it was to say that a definition is not needed, Laura referred to certain examples, like for example RPOs. She classified them as dual use. Dmitry was referring more to satellites that could carry out military and civilian functions, and then David was talking about a different definition, which would be the IHL definition, even if it was to say that IHL doesn't really consider dual use to be a thing in armed conflict. There was also a reference to dual use in other domains like chemical. I would even add an additional domain, which is that of export control, and all of these definitions are very different. And so one thing that caught my attention was a comment by Dmitry. He said that we could perhaps agree on a politically binding or a legally binding mechanism without having to define what dual use objects are. But we have all of these different ideas of what dual use objects are, and even I would point to the submissions to the Secretary General reports of Resolution 7536. Several states refer to dual use objects in these submissions, and when they use these words, they actually mean different things. So my question to all of the panelists is, do you think this could potentially become an issue in the future? Perhaps it is not one now, as Dmitry points out, but do you think it could become one in the future as we try to agree on norms or on binding agreements or just any sort of regulation of these types of objects? Perhaps, Dmitry, you would like to go first?
I agree that it's always better to have a definition than not to have one. So my main point is that at the same time it should not be a thing that prevents us from going further in our discussions and deliberations. And speaking about what is actually a dual use, well, the problem is that in many other domains of of disarmament, non-proliferation, arms control discussions, there is this challenge. Like we have this problem of dual capable weapons that can be either nuclear or non-nuclear. We have this issue of dual use goods that should fall under export controls or should not fall under export controls. I'm not sure that we can find a way to define this word, this notion that will suit everyone. As was just recently said during by the previous speaker, by David, that we need to. There is no problem of dual-use systems at wartime, but at the same and basically, if there is a civilian system that starts to engage in military activities, it immediately becomes a military one. That's the way I see it. And yes, that's it. But then there is always some actions that are trying to be concealed, or for a good reason, because if there is a military conflict, then everyone tries to gain as much advantage as possible. Then there is this notion, at least being discussed in the media, that, for example, our American colleagues are looking forward towards the so-called space reserve civilian fleet, like these reserve aircraft capabilities that already exist. What to do with these kind of things? Then there is this active, as I've mentioned, the active work on some prompt capabilities to launch small satellites into space. If this will we consider these launchers immediately military launchers in case of conflict, and so they will become more or less legitimate target for adversary, or as long as there is no definite data what is the type of payloads they are launching into space, they will remain civilian and protected by international humanitarian law. All these concerns are real, because that's basically the world we live in. So I think we will live with this problem of dual capabilities, dual capable systems and dual use systems for a long time, but this doesn't mean that we should not try to find solutions to address those. One of the ways to do it is simply to, well, to enforce strict rules of communication between the actors, that, well, you will have to explain, you will have to be clear about the actual missions of these or that systems. Again, I might be too optimistic, and we're still far from such a scenario, but otherwise we will eventually reach a situation of total chaos, because we have so many space sectors today. That I'll stop, and I'm looking forward to hear what my co-panelists will have to say.
Thank you for that, Dmitry. And if I may just say, at UNIDIR, we recently held a workshop with industry actors, and one of the issues that was raised was precisely this need for increased communication. So it makes me happy that there is consensus with industry there. If we could move on to David now.
I'll begin by saying that I'm a big fan of definitions in treaties or other legally operative instruments. It does seem to me that that's the way to pursue clarity and consistency in the application of the restraints. And the contrast here over time is quite dramatic. If you look at some of the early arms control treaties, and here I'm thinking about the Biological Weapons Convention, the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, the Limited Test Ban Treaty, those documents, reflecting the drafting style of their times, were brief and did not include definitions of the key terms. And that may have sufficed in the 1960s and the 1970s, but in implementation, there have been numerous controversies or uncertainties about the exact scope of those treaties. What were their parameters? What did they actually try to address? And subsequent treaties, the SALT I agreement, the START I agreement, and the treaties on peaceful nuclear explosions are much longer, much more elaborate. Laura mentioned the Chemical Weapons Treaty, which is 200 pages long, and all of those include numerous definitions to try to provide more specificity as to exactly what we mean. Now, to some extent, that is an exercise in futility, because every definition includes words that need their own definitions. And there could be an infinite regress in trying to be specific about what we actually mean when we're addressing these technical or political terms. Still, I think it is an advance to try to push the dialogue one step further and to try to provide at least somewhat greater clarity by including in any restriction on anti-satellite weapons or dual-use spacecraft some definitions of what we mean. And for my purposes, I would recommend that the key to an effective definition is the verbs, not the nouns. That is, try to restrict what countries would do in space, what their activities would be, what the satellite's functions could be, rather than trying to define what is an anti-satellite weapon. Try to define what are unacceptable behaviors. There's plenty of ambiguity in that as well, but it does seem to me that in general, when we talk about dual use capabilities, the restrictions should be premised on definitions about the activities, the verbs that are used in the agreement. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And I have to say, I agree. As a lawyer and a researcher myself, I am a big fan of definitions. Laura, perhaps we can hear from you now.
I guess coming from a technical perspective, what I think the phrase dual use capabilities does is draws our attention and helps us figure out how much attention to put where. And I agree with David that for dual use capabilities, however we're going to define them, that a focus on behaviors or verbs, as he said, is certainly a fruitful approach. It also helps us, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, sort of define what isn't dual use. I mean, because there are certainly, I think, as he said, precedents for negotiated agreements that have long, detailed descriptions of the technologies that they're talking about. And if the international community sees that certain types of technologies really are going to be problematic from a peacekeeping perspective, then certainly we would spend the time on long extended definitions. But of course, it does depend on what problem you're trying to solve. In David's remarks, he said one of them is to have appropriate targeting from an IHL perspective. And how do you do that? And that would be a definition. And even, he said there is no existence of a dual use system in IHL. At some point, is it 10% of military capability goes through the satellite and it's 90% commercial? What character does that object have? How do you know what that is? Who decides what that limit is? Is it every country's military codes decide that for themselves? Is there a shared agreement? Again, when you're talking about threatening objects in space, that's again where a definition might be helpful. When you have a dual use system, what is threatening behavior, and a shared sense of what that is. Again, I think the definitions is again in the behavior, what signals threatening behavior, and that gets you, fairly far. And again, I would also, again, looking at when you're talking about what our weapons, that almost certainly you'll need to restrict some types of technology, because you could have, if you don't do that, you end up with threatening technologies that are ready to be used but haven't yet been used, and they're not being restrained in any way. So, again, in my head, I think of those three categories. It's actually a pretty good guide to what your attention needs to be. Satellites that are purely civilian, have very little military or strategic use. That's most of them most likely, and some stuff are extremely threatening. And then we do want to spend a lot of our attention in the places, that gray space in between.
Thank you very much. I'm Pavel Podek from Unidir. Just to follow on this discussion, I generally agree that it's about behaviors, and that you could see whether a system is being positioned or designed or deployed to have a military function, military purpose. I think Laura mentioned the space mines, for example. That should be relatively easy to determine. However, another point that I think Laura made was that the space situational awareness capabilities are very unevenly distributed. So there are, to see what is going on, what other people do in space, you need to have ways of seeing that. You need to have assets, radars, satellites, that are not, it's not a trivial technology, and it's only a few countries actually have that. So it's a question to all panelists, yes, if we agree that we want to see the behavior, how do we see that? Do you have some ideas about how to make sure that we have a common ground here and the disputes could be resolved in a peaceful way? Thank you.
Laura, would you like to take that one first?
This is a compliance and verification question, which we have some experience with not just bilateral, but lots of experience with bilateral treaties, some experience with international treaties that have comprehensive verification mechanisms for example, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty has a big technical component to it, not yet into force, but a very mature technical component that has, pretty satisfactorily created a mechanism for gathering data that are trusted and communicated. So there is, a precedent for that. And I agree with you, that is a challenge because, of course, the United States has the vast majority of space surveillance assets, and certainly commercial satellite operators have their own, and other countries also have mature systems, but it's really uneven. If there, there are proposals in the civil sector for fusing those data in a way that creates fidelity and trust, sort of a trusted source of information, so that if one country is challenging another, saying that you're trailing me and you really need to leave out, and that country cannot say, yeah, well, I don't think that's happening, prove it. In some sense, there would be a trusted actor. I would note that, sometimes you can't count on this happening in every instance, but, there are ground-based observers who are pretty skilled, and they have, they watch, at least in low Earth orbits, what is happening pretty closely. And sometimes they draw attention to problematic behavior, which countries maybe would rather not be discussing in public, but they end up bringing that to public conversation. So there are sort of external checks, not official checks, to such a system. But in the short term, I could imagine, just when I have been thinking about it, it's not a mature idea, but if you have a certain set of very important satellites that you think, which I think you're not going to systematically survey 4,100 satellites 24/7 and find out what's happening in the environment of each of them. That's just too big of a job. But if there's a small subset of those, which are satellites, which could create a strategic issue if interfered with, you can imagine that might be a simpler effort. And each country would be surveying their own specific important satellites and, challenge, if they see challenging behavior, report it to this monitoring body, and you might imagine they form a judgment. It seems like a long, like a hard task given the way things work now, but you make a plan and you start moving it forward. You can imagine technical solutions to them if you have the political will. I guess I'm going to echo what Dmitry said. There are technical solutions when you have the political will.
Thank you for that, Laura. Dmitry, would you like to follow up?
I think there are two ways to address this challenge. One was Laura greatly explained this idea that there might be some external way to monitor things in space, and I totally agree that the best way to do it is not monitor all objects in space, but define the spacecraft that are of major concern. This is a great idea, I think, and this is probably where actually the scientific community, the researchers, the experts can come up with first list of such spacecraft that we as scholars consider the most important, and the interference with operations of these spacecraft might lead to great deterioration of international security. So I really like this idea. But if we speak about a broader issue of monitoring of space situation awareness, by which we mean awareness about everything that's going on in space, there might be, if we go through the commercial and public and open source way of doing this kind of stuff, we might run into the same challenge as with actually using the Earth's imaging from satellites, which has some limits due to some constraints due to national legislations. I think same hurdle will appear with regard to monitoring spacecraft, because in the end, the commercial providers of commercial images, as well as providers of space data, they will be constrained by a law of this or that nation for the operations on the Earth's surface. However, there were and there are some ideas about some types of joint data exchange centers on the national level between different countries. Unfortunately, they are yet to surface in a meaningful way, but given the existing capabilities in the US, in Russia, in China and India even, and other places, I think, and the possibility to establish these monitoring centers in virtual format, I think there is some room for work in this direction. Moreover, if we speak about a truly international effort, I'm absolutely sure that we can establish actually like some type of a physical space monitoring center with radars and things like that on some neutral or more or less neutral territory. And why I think it is possible is because, well, at least Russia is quite open to exporting the space purpose radars. There is one in China, and there are being developed or designed for other countries. So I think there are sources of the technology that can be repurposed for international use to provide more or less independent assessment of what is going on in space. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. David, over to you.
Thank you. And the point I would emphasize is the irony that even space situational awareness or space domain awareness, even that is a dual use capability. We want to think of it as a confidence building measure because it enhances everyone's ability to know what's going on in space, to understand threats, to discern when something goes wrong with a spacecraft, have a better ability to know whether that's a natural accident or an internal malfunction or a hostile act or something else. And that's a benign application. But space situational awareness is also very useful in an offensive military action. It's a key component of targeting is to know where the target is and what its status is. And after an attack, the post-strike battle damage assessment capability, the reconnaissance done to determine the effectiveness of the strike. All that is a completely military and hostile use of space situational awareness. So this tool is both simultaneously a confidence building measure and a threat building measure. And even that tool has to be assessed in that way. I've become increasingly attracted to the idea of reviving the proposals that were made decades ago by France, among others, for the establishment by treaty of some sort of international satellite monitoring agency, an entity that would design, construct, own, operate spacecraft that would monitor weapons-related activities both on Earth and in space and provide a globally shared awareness of activities in space, not under the control of any of the leading space powers. And the modern model for this, I think, is suggested by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, which even in its current provisional status has managed to construct around the world an international monitoring system of 300 stations that monitor a variety of technologies related to the explosive testing of nuclear weapons. Now that's a particular application of particular technologies, so it would not be directly relevant for monitoring space, but it does show how an international agreement can construct a widely acceptable burden-sharing arrangement that provides effective, authoritative, timely monitoring, not under the control of any one country, and with data and analysis that can be available for all. Seems to me that's a better way of enhancing the global awareness of activities in space. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. We do have some questions from people attending virtually. One of these questions is, how do you demonstrate good intent? Behaviour and intent is something that has been talked about, not just in this panel, but in other panels before this one. We would love to know your take on this. Perhaps we can start with Dmitry this time.
Thanks. Well, I think there are 2 points on the question that I would like to make. First, you avoid demonstrating malign intent. I mean, you try not to engage in activities that will be considered as hostile. This is the first thing. And well, before actually agreeing on that, we will need to discuss what is actually malign activity or hostile actions. So, well, what is the bad intent you will try to avoid to demonstrate? And I'll just reiterate, I entirely agree with the idea that we should talk about verbs, not nouns. This is the perfect framing and phrasing of my thoughts as well. And second, well, I think the best way to demonstrate good intent is just to be as clear as possible about what is the purpose of this or that capability, what are the missions you are undertaking. We definitely like it, and for a good reason. As I've said earlier, well, I think it is a natural desire to conceal your capabilities and to conceal your what your spacecraft can do and is being trained to do. And this is well, this is the sad reality we live in, where international security is not in a perfect shape, and we have great power competition, and this is not the best situation, where not the most healthy situation in terms of enhancing transparency. But as have been already mentioned with other areas like nuclear arms control and so on, the space domain is even more a domain where cooperative security measures can be useful, can be more useful than actual like self-help, as some people call it. So I think there are ways for any country to demonstrate good intent and to avoid demonstrating bad intent for its own good, because I'm absolutely sure that no one would like to have a hostile environment and space and have their satellites threatened by adversaries or even by third parties. So yeah, I hope it makes sense, and with that I'll stop.
Thank you, Dmitry. I think it does make sense. Let's move on to David this time.
Well, thank you. Here, I guess I'll be the skeptic and doubt the role of intent in these kinds of considerations. To me, intent or purpose is a relevant factor, but it's so subjective. It's like beauty or truth or sense of humor that's very difficult to discern objectively, and is so much internal or in the eye of the beholder that it's not often a reliable measure for legal implications. There are times when law does focus on intent. In criminal law, the reasons why someone does something, the mens rea, the guilty state of mind, does matter in the definition of a crime or in assessing the factors that might mitigate or exacerbate the punishment. But when we translate from individual intentions for human beings in criminal law to state intentions, national actors in space programs, an awful lot of meaning is lost. There's a great deal of abstraction in attempting to assign to countries human behaviors like intentions. A complicated artificial creation like a state or a government just does not have intentions in the same way that human beings can have intentions. We always talk about it that way. We talk about countries behaving as if they were unitary, rational actors. But we all know that's just not true, that there's a great abstraction in assigning human traits and behaviors to creations like states or governments. And so therefore, I would be focused more on the actions, what countries do or refrain from doing, rather than the intentions or the state of mind behind them. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Laura, would you like to go next?
I think there are a couple of ways to look at this. One is intentions in a writ large, generally. You know, a statement from the highest levels of a government of high-level strategy and policy. For example, a nuclear weapon, no first use policy would be a statement that's clear about intentions for a technology. And then you look to see if the structure of the deployed technology sort of follows from that statement. And you can imagine corollaries or analogies to space for something like that. No first use of weapons, no first deployment of weapons, no first, etc. And then you see that the technology follows that. So that's sort of one high level of just helping provide some clarity to the degree that countries trust each other and trust but verify, etc. I think that's an important step. In terms of intent, I'm not sure, but I think this question is pointed towards some of these questions about dual use systems and their behaviors, and whether you could classify a behavior as malign or benign. And maybe you don't necessarily have to. I think we keep coming back to the proximity operations example. If you were to say, you may not approach my satellite closely without declaring why you're coming so closely first. And there would be an appropriate channel for that. And if there were a sort of a keep out zone type situation, there may be an agreed number of visits per year that other countries could closely approach to make sure that that satellite be within the keep out zone was what the owner declared it was to be. And there are ways to provide clarity about behaviors. So if you do that, then if you closely approach outside of the agreed parameters, outside of the agreed times, then your behavior is suspected of being malign rather than benign. And you just, by being outside the bounds of the agreed rules, you are suspect. If close approach is the behavior of concern, there are ways you can signal that you don't want to be misinterpreted by perhaps making your satellite more easily tracked. You include a reflector that doesn't make the sky light up in any way, but a reflector that allows it to be tracked more closely with more precision. And you're saying, please, I want you to know where I am at all times. I have this ability to maneuver, but I would like to make sure that it's not misinterpreted. So I want to make sure that you know where I am at all times. And for many beneficial uses, that seems to me to be absolutely no problem. It's hard to imagine that you would disagree with that. So there are ways in terms of policy and in terms of technology that you can sort of put your cards on the table saying, the intent of what I have here is benign. That does, of course, I think you're all thinking, well, that sets out militaries who might want to use these technologies in a time of conflict in a different way. That I think gets addressed within the rules. The more sort of strictly focused rules on military uses of space and sort of strategic uses. But again, I keep coming back to this. You can exclude a lot of behaviors as misapprehended, malign intent by transparency and declaratory policy.
Thank you so much, Laura. For our next question, we just talked about intent, and David mentioned actions. And I want to turn to what about lack of action? The next question deals with whether you're aware of any use of commercial service in conflicts on Earth, where the commercial service provider has tried to maintain a position of neutrality, and how. And I would extend this question to just address how the issue of neutrality would work when it comes to dual-use objects. I think David has highlighted before how difficult this can be from the perspective of precautions. So maybe, David, do you want to take this one first?
This is one of the ways in which the genius of capitalism helps solve a problem, because ordinarily a commercial service provider would be impartial and would offer the commercial services to any customer, alternatively to both or all sides in an armed conflict. That's how they try to make a buck, is by selling commercial services, imagery, or communication services or other products to any and all customers. And indeed, the law of armed conflict requires that if a country and that country's satellites seek to remain neutral in an armed conflict, then it must practice non-discrimination. It cannot be partial to either side in an armed conflict. And that's led to some unusual circumstances where, for example, the United States has sometimes exercised checkbook shutter control by purchasing all the photographs that a particular spacecraft could generate over a conflict zone, even if the United States did not need all the imagery. By buying it all, it precluded the other side from buying up any of the imagery. And from the commercial standpoint, that's a fine outcome. It's more difficult with other kinds of satellite services where there is a much broader array of potential users, and therefore the commercial actor would have to decide either to be available to all sides in an armed conflict or not. And if you choose not, then you are exposing yourself as a partisan in the armed conflict and becoming even more a lawful subject of armed attack.
Dmitry, would you like to have a go?
Well, I just very short remark on that because, again, David explained it perfectly. I'd say that sometimes the commercial imagery providers have a role in so-called gray zone conflicts when some people have access to images to make this or that point about actions in this or that country, while others cannot prove or disprove this because they do not have access to the same imagery, and sometimes, as I have explained earlier, sometimes you simply do not have commercial imagery of sites, of this or that sites, due to national legislation with which this or that commercial provider should comply. And this probably is not as a threatening situation, because I hardly imagine a story when someone will engage in a military activity against the provider of commercial satellite imagery for when this imagery is being used for this or that propaganda purposes. But probably some actions that are not military in nature can be taken against these providers. For example, hostile environment to their activities within that country. If they have representative, then they will face some tax issues. They will need to comply with much more strict procedures if they want to continue their commercial operations in that country. Things like that. To some extent, it's comparable to what is going on with the huge IT corporations like Google or Apple in this or that countries all over the world. Well, that's the reality we live in. As for actual military conflicts, I believe that most countries that need to use satellite imagery for their operations, they will use national imagery. However, if this or that commercial provider can have some extra value for money, they will definitely use it. And again, I think that countries are fully capable of having intermediaries in obtaining this or that data from commercial providers without disclosing that this data will be used for military purposes. Yeah, that's what I have to say about this subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dmitry. We have another question from the floor here in Geneva. I think it's Pavel again.
I just want to go back to something that I believe Laura mentioned briefly, and look at a different kind of dual use. Because as I understand, when in this context, and the idea of this panel was the dual use as the kind of the difference between or the potential military use of satellite, civilian satellite systems. And but there is another kind of dual use, which is a potential military use of in space of systems that were designed for other military purposes, like missile defense was mentioned. And I think that is a particular concern, as I understand, for some countries, and this is a potentially contentious issue. So, in a way, again, it is possible, and I think it is feasible to, if someone would decide to deploy missile defense with space components, those space-based interceptors, they would be perfectly usable as anti-satellite weapons. So I don't know. I just want to pose this question to the panel. Sort of, do you see that as a problem? Do you see that as a problem of the say in the same category, if you will, or it is something that is completely out of the field? Thank you.
Dmitry, do you want to take this one first?
Well, as I've mentioned, deployment of any strike capabilities in space would become like a major change in what we're talking about. And it won't matter much what are the intended targets. They can be perfectly used for anything. I would even add that even deployment of so-called self-defense capabilities that actually were designed even like back in the Soviet Union and in the USA during the previous Cold War and previous space arms race, even in that case, these capabilities that were, well, dual use. They can be used to protect your satellite or space station, and they can be used to take out your adversary satellite or space station, or even use it against some targets on Earth, although of course it's much harder. If we speak about missile defense assets in space, well, they will become like priority targets for all adversaries that consider themselves as possible targets for these developments. And in the end, it will lead only to even increased development of capabilities to address those. And inherently, it will become like even not a first strike target, but even like a 0.5 strike target. Even before the first strike, you will need to take out these missile defense assets in space because otherwise they can deprive you of anything that you can think of. So yeah, I think this is one of the worst case scenarios that will lead to even to enormous deterioration of the relations in space, because even currently, as I've mentioned earlier, I believe with intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance satellites in space, they can definitely, well, not definitely, but probably and definitely in the future can be used for targeting and even for so-called like left of launch missile defense. Well, we all saw these schemes and infographics where, well, there is a space layer for left of launch. And left of launch is basically when you do not let your adversary to actually launch the missiles from the launchers. So this, even without strike platforms in space, when we speak about the space layer for missile defense, it already led to very nervous situation and in pursuit of capabilities against such assets. If we see strike weapons in space, things will spiral out of control quite fast. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dmitry. Laura, do you want to have a go at this one?
I agree with everything Dmitry said, and thank you, Pavel, for pulling that out of my initial remarks. I think strategic missile defenses and bodyguard defensive weapons are going to be a real challenge. Should countries decide that these are important. I think they will be, the space components of those will be as Dmitry said, prime targets, and will, as they are being launched, will become a real challenge in the moment. Even my expectations, there'll be a challenge in the moment, even prior to any conflict. I think countries will, frankly, if someone was to build a space-based missile defense interceptor system, I think it would be challenged very quickly. And as Dmitry said, you don't even need the actual strike weapons in space to make countries nervous. Just the targeting apparatus is something that's of real concern, and I think a real place where things may get out of control very quickly. Something I'm very concerned about. So yes, defensive weapons in space, again, because it is very hard to defend satellites. And it's also hard to defend against ballistic missiles. Those defensive systems look fairly weak and can look pretty quickly like something that is meant for offense. A space-based interceptor system to be effective against even one or two ballistic missiles would need to be comprised of hundreds of satellites, if not thousands of satellite-borne interceptor weapons. So anything short of that provides, an opportunity for a launching missile to go through, without being intercepted. So, between a few weapons and those hundreds, those interceptors will look like offensive weapons because they couldn't mount a good defense. So my guess is while that draws a lot of concern and attention, I don't think that that's, in the cards from a technical point of view, because they can be challenged so easily. But I think the idea that has been floated of defensive bodyguard weapons, which are kinetic in nature or directed energy in nature, are something that really needs a lot of attention before we go too far down this road without any guidelines of what's appropriate behavior and what isn't.
Thank you, Laura. And last but not least, David.
Thank you. The only point that I would add here is that there's a bit of a shell game going on in the characterization of an activity as an anti-missile system versus an anti-satellite system. And this is a little bit of a glib take on the history, but maybe not too much of an exaggeration, that 30 years ago or so, when the anti-ballistic missile treaty was in force between the United States and the Soviet Union, that prohibited deployments and testing of ABM systems. At that time, when the United States or the Soviet Union wanted to develop such a weapon, they would say, oh no, we're not testing an anti-missile system, we're merely testing an anti-satellite system. Anti-ballistic missile systems are illegal, but anti-satellite systems are okay, and there's some crossover in the technology, but that's what we're doing. Now, as the law and the politics have shifted, and the ABM treaty has gone away, and the popular tide has shifted against anti-satellite weapons testing, now, when the countries want to develop this technology, they say, oh no, we're not testing anti-satellite systems, we're merely testing anti-missile systems, and that's legal and politically less problematic, but it's the same technology, or at least there's a substantial amount of overlap between the technologies. During the time when the anti-ballistic missile treaty was enforced, there was an effort, ultimately not very successful, at demarcation, at defining some technical characteristics that would separate missile systems that were capable of intercepting intercontinental range missiles versus defensive systems against shorter range systems. And there was some thought that one could preserve the ABM treaty while still allowing development of systems that would be capable of intercepting shorter range systems based on their speed and the angle of arrival. I'm not sure that technically would have proven to be a successful demarcation in the long term, but maybe there's something like that that's capable on a technical basis of differentiating between ABM and ASAT systems, but I'm not very hopeful that that shell game can be defeated.
Thank you so much, David. We don't have a lot of time left. So I would just like to quickly take a step back. We have been talking about very specific topics, and I would like to bring the conversation to a more general one. So we have been talking about the uncertainty surrounding dual-use objects. I would like to ask you how this uncertainty surrounding this object works against the goals of Paris, the prevention of an arms race in outer space, or on the contrary, how can dual-use objects aid in fulfilling the objectives of Paris? And on that note, somebody from the virtual audience asked about the role that commercial actors can play in this conversation, since they are increasingly important. Perhaps we can start with Laura here.
As I understand it, the question is both how does the characterization of things as dual use help or hinder the goals of Paros, and whether commercial satellite sector will, what's their role? I think that's what you said. I think we did a fairly, we covered a lot of ground in this panel about whether dual use will help stability, will help sort of peaceful uses prevail in space and make space secure and sustainable for users. So I think, again, in my mind, I think the phrase dual use helps us decide how much attention we want to pay to different technologies. Again, with that definition being the split between technologies that are used for civilian and military uses, but also technologies that are used for military defensive and military offensive uses. So I think it's telling us these are places that are complex and are going to need a lot of our attention to build confidence and transparency, but I think also rules on behavior and likely rules on technology. The role of commercial sector, I know them less. Of course, I spend most of my time thinking from the nation state perspective. And of course, I think David will tell us all that all space actions have a state character because of the Outer Space Treaty. They are meant to be under the auspices of the responsibility and the I think it was enduring guidance and control. No, that's the wrong phrase, but he'll tell us what it is. That provides a funny framework here. I don't know if commercial actors will be more interested now that David is, of course, illuminating this question that satellites must have either military or civilian character once hostilities break out, and whether they are concerned about the debris and other security characteristics of an increasingly insecure space environment. We have approaches to mitigate unintentional debris or careless debris, but of course, the destruction of any one large satellite would make space in those orbits that are highly used, would make space very difficult to use and very expensive. So I would hope that they see their interests align with Paros goals and see that very clearly. But I don't have any specific suggestions about how to bring them into the conversation more fruitfully.
Thank you for that, Laura. David, would you like to go next?
Thank you. I would like to pick up on the point that Laura mentioned there at the end, the relationship between the state and the private actors who undertake activities in space. And as many in this audience undoubtedly know, international law is different with respect to space on state responsibility than it is in any other area. In every other realm, a state and the private persons, the private corporations, are separate legal entities, and the state is not responsible for the bad acts, the incursions of liability that are done by its private actors. If you are harmed by a private person, a foreign private person or foreign corporation, you may have a cause of action against them, but you do not have a cause of action ordinarily against their state. They're just separate actors. In space, however, the Outer Space Treaty creates a separate rule saying that the state is responsible for the actions of its national actors, whether those are private or public, so that if a private corporation associated with state X undertakes space activities and incurs liability, tort or criminal or political liability, that is attributable to the state. The state is responsible and has an obligation to exercise continuing supervision over the activities of the state of the non-state actors. Space law is different in that respect. And for me, what that suggests is that it really is time for the world to get moving on something like measures toward Paros, or further to restrict the dangers of armed competition and the use of military force in outer space. A common line that gets used in the United States by the Space Force and others is that outer space is just a place. It's just a domain like every other domain. And all of those domains have, over time, known arms races and hostility, and the same will undoubtedly, inevitably happen in space. I'm not sure I buy that. I think space can be different. I think space is different in some respect. But one way in which space is very different is that in the other realms, there have been concerted and successful efforts at arms control. And in space, very little of that has been done. There has not been a conspicuous, sustained effort to try to limit armed forces and armed activities in outer space. Since the time of the Outer Space Treaty, the world has seen progress in arms control in virtually every other sector. Treaties comprehensively limiting biological weapons and chemical weapons, and treaties imposing important restrictions on nuclear weapons. Space is the one realm where diplomacy has been unsuccessful and barely attempted. And I think that's one where the message going forward is that to protect the private sector interests in space and to protect the public order of space, we need more treaty negotiations. We need to do something about this problem at the level of national governments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Dmitry, would you like to take the floor?
Yeah, thanks. Well, again, I'll try to have a few brief remarks. One is that from where they stopped, this idea that space can be different, I agree with that. The only challenge with that is probably that in other domains we tried to engage in arms control after we realized the level of threat and the volume of deployed weapons of this or that types. I think this is the huge challenge that we've seen. And then after that we try to engage in arms controls. In space, luckily, we're still far from the weaponization that existed or exists in other domains. It doesn't mean that we have to wait for the weaponization per se. But I think we need to look for proper arguments why we shouldn't wait for this weaponization and why space is different. One reason in that is that basically, in space, it is much harder to silo the challenge. It's much harder in space to actually limit the theater of war, the theater of the volume of war fighting, and so on. This is one of the reasons why probably we should engage in arms control before we first engage in arms race. And after all, we have a huge volume of experience on what can and what cannot be done. So we need to be more active in promoting this point. And I think that that the measures to prevent weaponizations are being promoted even by state actors is good. And now to the original question about the role of commercial actors in preventing the arms race in space. Well, to put it in the most simple terms, I think this role can be twofold. First, of course, commercial actors need to see a safe outer space, and for a good reason, because otherwise, they will be deprived of their incomes. Basically, they will have nothing to provide to the customer if there will be a huge threat environment in space. On the other hand, at least some of the commercial actors might even profit from the arms race in space if they will find a way to attach themselves to this or that state program related to actual military and weaponization efforts. So, well, in the perfect world, probably we will have some code of conduct for commercial actors, effectively preventing them from engaging in activities that promote arms racing. But unfortunately, we are not living in a perfect world, and it's hard to be sure that no commercial actor will engage in such activities. Yes, and I'll stop. And once again, thanks for a fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Dmitry. We are a bit short in time, but we can certainly accommodate you.
Satellites activities are by nature global, and we meet international agendas, such as the search for global partnerships, like my company, defining joint missions for peaceful use in humanitarian benefits. Thus, would it not be interesting to create groups of global representations, such as neutral global arbitration tribunals, which would be able to evaluate the definitions and behavior of these activities in legal terms by means of forms formulated in such a way that it would be possible to recognize the real motive of the missions rather than the difficulty task of building physical surveillance for such monitoring attitudes for civil or governmental actors?
Okay, Dmitry, you have the floor.
If I understand the question correctly, well, of course, there are difficult tasks for all sorts of, for everything you do in space. But although this doesn't mean that there are no technically feasible way to achieve it. And it's great that we are currently in a stage where there is growing interest in how to fulfill this or that missions and actions in space, and how to actually have proper monitoring of activities in space. And while I agree that there are limits to any of these capabilities, and actually limits not only to the capabilities, but back to one of the discussions that we've already had previously, limits to like how to demonstrate intent and behavior. I think that even discussing these capabilities, discussing these limits, is fruitful in its own, because as with the declaratory policies and so on, it doesn't. If we speak about international security, even if we do not have the 100% true picture of the challenge of the tasks that we are trying to solve, 100% true picture of what actually happened, the discussions around this situation help us to navigate through this or that crisis. Of course, I'm not trying to say that there is always a perfect way out of any crisis, and we know for sure that some crises remain unresolved, including due to absence of a perfect picture of the crisis itself. But sorry for like not very concise answer to this question, but I think that we need to have a room and platform for any type of discussions, even if we don't have one perfect capability, perfect technical capabilities. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much for your answer, Dmitry. I'd like to thank all of the panelists here today. Thank you for being here with us and for engaging in such an interesting discussion. Also, thank you to all of the attendees. Thank you for your questions, both those of you virtually and here in person. And also, last thanks go to all of the organisers that have been working here behind the scenes: Letitia, Maria, Ellie, Jamie, Wilfred and Pavel. Thank you so much for all your help. Lastly, I'd like to thank all of the people that have been helping us in organising this. We've had the financial and organisational support from governments of the Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China and the French Republic, as well as the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique with the financial support of the European Union and the Secure World Foundation. Thank you very much.